It's cold in New York.
It is.
You know, I love when I turn on my radiators for the first time and my house smells like it's burning down. It's
Yeah.
just a
All
nice
the
little
dust.
reminder of how much New York City loves me.
Yeah. Yeah. All the dust that's in your vents or wherever. Just, yeah.
I always
Fun.
freak out and think I left like a blanket or a sheet on top of the radiator in my bedroom or living
Yeah.
room. But it's just one of those fun things that, 10 years into New York, it's like, oh yeah, that happens every year. And there's nothing to worry about.
You know what's funny is that I look forward to like when it gets cold. It's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna experience that burning smell. It's almost like lighting a candle, you know?
Cleansing the
Yeah.
gorgeous October weather. October has been gorgeous for like 2 or 3 weeks, and then all of a sudden it was just like, and you're done.
Yeah.
Cool. So we got some fun stuff to talk about today. We want to talk about Catalyst, Tailwind's UI component library. I also worked on like an auto scroller component for streaming text, like you would get from our friends in AI land, the LLM models, and tweeted about that. So I could talk about how I built that a little bit. And yeah, we'll see where we're at after that.
Cool.
So, what do you want to talk about with Catalyst?
Yeah. I've been using Catalyst for the last few weeks on a side project, and I've really been enjoying it. And um, Catalyst is great, but there's like this workflow that kind of falls out of Catalyst that I haven't experienced with other component libraries. And I just wanted to talk about that. So, just to set the stage, Catalyst is a UI component library from Tailwind. You can think of it like ShadCN or Radix themes. Is that fair? Like it's that level of
I think
component
it's more
library.
like ShadCN because it is code that's built on top of libraries where you don't import from Catalyst. There's nothing to import from Catalyst, whereas in Radix themes, you import from Radix themes.
Yes, that is a great point. The code is code that you install in your app. So you download a zip file, extract it, and it's all the components are in your components directory. So you're going to be doing like local imports and all that. Um, okay, so the thing I've been enjoying about it is that if you compare Catalyst to some of the other component libraries, it's a lot smaller. There's not as many components. This might just be, because it's newer. And I was kind of worried that like, oh, well, eventually I'm going to build a UI and Catalyst isn't going to have a component for it. But I ran into this a few times, and my workflow has been first check Catalyst and see if Catalyst has a component for it. And they have all the common components like forms and drop downs and things like switches, the common components that you would expect to see in every app. If I can't find it in Catalyst, I then go over to Tailwind UI, which is, I don't know how you would describe Tailwind UI. It's a bunch of uh, HTML components that are built using Tailwind, and they have a whole bunch of different variants. So
It's
usually
kind of
I
the
can,
same thing. It's like a copy pastable component. It can be in HTML or React, but it's a single shot example. It's specific for a single example instead of trying to be more like a design system component that would accommodate all sorts of use cases in your app. That's
exactly.
how
I
I
would say
describe it.
Catalyst is going to like, it's full React. So it has like keyboard shortcuts and state and all this stuff where Tailwind UI feels more like HTML examples that you're going to pull in.
Yeah. There's some Tailwind UI components that wrap headless. And so they
Yeah, they
have
do.
the
They
React
if they have like a
interactivity.
list, yes. Yep.
Right.
Yep. Um, so there was like an example where I wanted breadcrumbs and I couldn't find it in Catalyst, and so I went to Tailwind UI and I pulled it in, and it was nice. It almost felt like you're just dropping down a layer.
Mm-hmm.
Which yeah, I thought it was great. Like it was great. I got it right in my app. I created a breadcrumbs component. I don't think it's like robust as if Catalyst had its own breadcrumbs component,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't feel. I've often found with these component libraries, if they don't have a component, you just immediately drop out and you are on your own. You are in an empty
Mm-hmm.
React component and you have to create this on your own now. And I did not feel that way with Catalyst because it felt like, okay, you're just going to go to Tailwind UI. find it, and now you're not starting from an empty React component. You're starting with a React component that has some markup and some Tailwind classes, and they look great. They really do. They look awesome.
I think that's a great example. And I had a similar thing happen where I was using Catalyst for a demo for a YouTube video, and they didn't have like a button group, and I wanted to try one. And I knew like Shad had it. I know I could build it myself if I used the button, like a toggle thing from Headless or from Radix, but I didn't want to. Like that was the whole point of using these things, is I didn't want to do it myself. So then I was just like, maybe I'll use Shad for this or something else. Going to Tailwind UI as a result of like needing something else that's not in Catalyst. I didn't even think about that at the time, because usually I've used Tailwind UI mostly as like inspiration for like design stuff, and sometimes I'll copy the code. Um, but that what you said makes me think it would be really cool if in Catalyst, like on the buttons page at the bottom, it had like button groups, and it almost like linked you to the parts of Tailwind UI that are extensions of what you're looking at in Catalyst. So if I need a radio, for example, they have like radio inputs,
Hmm.
and I wanted like the radio toggle panel things, which are like act like radio inputs, but they are more decorated.
Yep.
And I understand that Catalyst is supposed to be like, it is styled, but it's not like designed. Maybe that's one way to say it. Like the buttons are styled. They have styles, opinionated styles, but they're not like designed in the context of your app. Again, they're meant to be more general purpose and more like design systemy, more base level. But it is a common organization now to go to a site that looks like the Catalyst docs
Hmm.
and look for, a slide over panel. It's going to be easy to find in a doc site like Catalyst. Whereas until in UI, it's like marketing and application UI. So maybe there's a cool opportunity there for them to quickly link you from the Catalyst parts to like the level up or the level down if you need it, based on what's in Tailwind UI.
Yeah, totally. They do have so many different components and designs and at different levels. But
Right,
I just really appreciated that. Like, okay, it's not in Catalyst, but I'm not on my own just yet. I get to drop
right.
down to
That's
the
cool.
Tailwind UI. I had this happen a few more times where I was building kind of what you said, like a fancy radio select, where you could
Mm-hmm.
select like different panels, similar to in the Radix course how you do the Apple
Right,
selector.
right,
I needed something like that, and that wasn't in Catalyst, and um, I didn't want just like the Tailwind classes, the
right,
types of stuff that I would find in Tailwind UI. But then because Catalyst is built on headless UI,
right,
kind of the next level down was to go over to headless UI and
right,
find their examples. And so I was able to pull in headless UI, which Catalyst is built on. But I pulled in headless UI and got the radio group styled. Use a headless radio group component. You can think of headless UI as more analogous to something like Radix.
right.
So you are dropping
Unstyled
down,
behavioral components.
right? So you're dropping down even lower, but again, you're not on your own, which
Right,
I really appreciate. So I was able to build this like little. It was like almost like this color badge selector using the radio group component, and yeah, between those three levels, I felt like I always know like, okay, I'm building a page. First check Catalyst, then check Tailwind UI, then check Headless. And if you get like through those three and you still feel like, okay, there's nothing in these, well, at that point, like you're building something bespoke,
right.
like some really custom React component. Anyway, I just wanted to say I really like that workflow, and I never felt like, oh, it's not in my design system, it's not in my UI component library, and now I am just completely left out to sea on my own.
Right.
So
The way we used to feel with something like Bootstrap or whatever, where if it's not there, you're just done.
yeah, even when I use yeah, even when I've used like Radix, I've kind of felt that way where it's like, oh, it's not in Radix, and therefore I guess I shouldn't be doing it.
Right.
And it's not like a
Or like there's some components that like Aria has, like date pickers that aren't in Radix. But yeah, if it's not there, maybe you just use a native date picker instead of trying to do something custom. Um,
yeah. It just and Radix is like a really complete component library. They have a ton of stuff, and they have Radix themes built on top of it. I just hate the feeling of like it's either there or it's not, and you're on your own. And
mhm.
it felt like there was more of a gradient with the
Right.
Catalyst Tailwind UI headless curve. So yeah, I just wanted to
Nice.
mention that. And again, it's someone that is I want things that look good. I also don't want to spend a lot of time on, and
Right.
I know that if I'm in headless UI, I'm going to be spending a lot of time on it
Right.
because it's behavior, not styling.
Right.
Anyway,
Right. Right. That's cool.
I
It's
appreciate
almost
it.
like
I
you
think the
could.
library's. Oh, I I appreciate that, and I think the library is worth checking out.
Nice. I definitely think it's worth checking out. It's gorgeous. The stuff they have in there is really gorgeous. I feel like you could train like an AI, your Copilot, to like follow that algorithm that you had. Like, I need a selector box. First, it checks Catalyst, then it checks
Yeah.
10 UI, then it falls back to a custom one. We were talking about this week because I've been listening to the Cursor podcast on Lex Friedman with the guys who made it. And a lot of times when I have used AI, like things like Copilot, um, it like does too much, or you use V0 to start scaffolding something new. That's fine, but you want to iterate on it. And a lot of times for a site that's like you're iterating on, like a build UI has been around for like a year or two, and you want to add like a new component, you just want it to match what's already in there. So you almost want to just say, give me a radio group, follow the styles that I have. Like what I would love is, let's say you do need to make the radio selector, and it's not in Catalyst yet, but Catalyst has certain styles it's opinionated about. The buttons look a certain way. They have like plain outline default. They have like a nice subtle shadow. It's like very specifically done, which is why it looks so good. And you want that to port over to like whatever you're adding. So it'd be cool if your editor could help you scaffold the version of the component that you need using the libraries you're using, and like make it look like a button, make it share the same outline and shadow styles, but just get me started. Because a lot of what those libraries I like, when I copy and paste from them, I like the details, like the focus styles,
Hmm.
the rings or the outlines and shadows are a certain way. They're not just like shadow from Tailwind. They're specific. They change responsively. That's the stuff that's hard to get right and make sure it gets consistent.
Yep.
So even if you could
Yeah.
just create that in the same way that the Catalyst components are created in your editor, in your project, you could just tell it to look at the Catalyst components and then say, I need, a slider from Radix because there's no slider, so I'm going to use like the headless slider from Radix. But I want it to like look and have the same look and feel, whether it's transitions and colors, as all of these components. I think that would be pretty awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be very, very cool.
Yeah. I feel like that's kind of where we're going in a lot of ways, where already, because React's composition is so good, we've have apps, and we've worked with clients on apps that have some Radix components, might need an Aria component, or they started out with an older Bootstrap component and now they're pulling in Radix stuff, and the boundaries are good. They don't clobber each other, so you can use them all together. It feels like with a lot of these UI libraries, that's where we're headed, where it's like, I just need this next thing. It's like it's just one thing. So I don't actually care as much about this library having everything.
Hmm.
At this point, if we were working on an app and they used drop down from Radix or drop down from Aria or drop down from Headless, it wouldn't matter. We know them
Right.
all. And what matters, what's hard, is not those things anymore because they're kind of solved problems from the application developer's perspective. What's hard is getting the look and feel to match the other parts of your app and UI. So that would be cool if AI editors get there, or even these component libraries have options for matching it, or it's derived from like design tokens or something like that. So
It is interesting, yeah, that the headless libraries have all converged, and
yeah,
we're pretty happy with them. We're able to mix and
yep,
match them. It's great, great great proof of like their composition.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I guess the next frontier is getting the styling layer in there and making it easy to change and look good in your app and all that.
And I think it's going to be like adaptive styling. That would be what I would want. Like,
Yeah.
it's not my fingers. It's not that I want every project I work on to look the same. It's that I want to go into a custom design site like a buildui.com and say, I want a new button or a new input type for a form. And we have other forms, and it can look at that and see what shadows, what paddings, and, all that stuff. So
Yeah.
that's
Very
that's
cool.
cool though. I really like Catalyst though, and I'm excited to see where it goes. It's good for sure. It has lots of nice subtle details in it. Um, been using Shadcn more too with a consulting client, and it's fun. Their install story is really awesome. I mean, talk about just like I need a drop down in my app. It's like a command. It's like that project is optimized for you, like typing in like shad drop down, copying and pasting, and like you're done. Or a slide over that's like, nice on mobile and desktop. It's very fast, very efficient. The install step is really good. It's really, really cool.
Cool.
Um, so cool. That's neat. Next, let's talk about this little hook I wrote. So it's actually a hook and a component. And I'll put a link to like my tweet with a little video in the show notes. But we've been working with some AI models on our consulting projects, and some of the open source ones, especially, have very different streaming rates, very like unpredictable or just not inconsistent. They're not like steady. Um, the chunk size changes. And so I was working on how could we make this at the UI layer kind of display and rendered nicely, regardless of what your backend is sending up, regardless if you're using like a small model that's fast or you're using a bigger model that takes a long time and then gives you big chunks. Um, we've looked at like ChatGPT and Claude artifacts and Perplexity and all these things that use AI to show their responses. They've put a lot of time into the polish part, and it just the way it kind of reveals all of the text. There's even harder cases where sometimes like the response that comes back includes like components embedded in it. Like Evan's talk at ReactConf, where it comes back with like a weather widget. So how would you like reveal that? How would you know when to chunk it up? Anyways, I took a stab at this and ended up with some pretty cool like hooks and components. The first one is a useBufferedText hook. So you pass it in the text. Usually when you make a call to an LLM, you get back a response. It's a stream. You iterate over it, and then you just append to some React state, and that's a string. So you just say like, on each chunk, basically set text, and then text plus new chunk, something like that, decoded new chunk. So that's just like a big string, and it has new lines in it. So then you render it inside of either a pre-tag if it's code, or like a paragraph tag with pre-white space CSS class, which will wrap it when there's new lines. So you don't have to like split it into multiple p tags and anything like that. And it works. You just see like the blocks come up. So the way my hook works is you take, it's called use buffered text, and you pass in text to it, the text that's updating. And what it returns is a buffered text piece of React state that re-renders, every so often based on an animation speed that you give it. And the animation speed will take the first segment of text, whether it's a word or a character, calculate how many segments there are till the end of the text you pass in, and then kick off a frame motion animation that animates a progress motion value from 0 to 1. And let's say it does it over 10 seconds. So you give it a chunk of text, which is like the first paragraph of The Great Gatsby. You say split by word, and buffered text says, okay, progress is at 0. There's 80 chunks, and I'm going to animate this progress from 0 to 1, like 0 to 100%, right?
Wait, quick question. You're not appending to this text yet. You're just giving it a paragraph.
Yes, let's start with
And
that.
yeah, okay, cool.
Yep. So you give it a paragraph of text and you want use buffered text to kind of do this reveal animation. You give it the paragraph, and what the buffered text hook does is it splits it either by character or word. It kicks off a new motion value, a new motion, a frame of motion animation that animates something called progress from 0 to 1. And what you can do is give it an on update call to this animation that you started. So every time it updates, you get like a tick, like a frame with the latest value of progress. And so let's say it takes 10 seconds to animate from 0 to 1. So what is like 100 divided by, yeah. So it's like 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, something like that. Or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And so you get a call back. Progress is at 10%, which means buffered text should return 10% of the text, right?
Cool.
So you
Cool.
have your array of segments, and then you just do 10% times the segments dot length, and that's your new index. It's like a cursor, basically, and you set that cursor, and then in the response, the return value from the hook, you return segments dot slice 0 to that cursor, and then you join it back again based on whether you're splitting by a word or a character. And so you get basically a substring of the text, right?
That continuously updates over some interval.
Exactly. Every time the progress animation has a new tick and it reaches like a new floored percentage, like because segment if progress is going from 0% to 100% and it goes like 0, 1, 2, 3, and all of those correspond to a segment of 1, then you're still returning the same
The same text.
first word or whatever, same text. So it returns the same string.
Cool.
And then once the percentage gets to a threshold where the new segments, it returns a new segment, the use buffered text hook will refire.
Cool. So
And
you could use
yep.
this, like, you don't need to be using AI for this if you want to do like a cool reveal on a homepage of like a paragraph being, or not a paragraph, like a wall of text being displayed. You could use something like this.
Exactly. You could do it by word, by character, by line. You can just give it a paragraph of text, and it's just a hook that re-renders every time the segment updates. It can look like it's being typed out or written out. You could even, I was kind of also thinking about it, like it's cool when you split it by word and you tweak the timing. It's kind of like a teleprompter, if you think about it.
Cool.
It's just a teleprompter. It just
Very
reveals
cool.
like a script, and and if you change the timing, it can go like it's actually really easy to read.
You can get like
The
speaking
cadence. Right, exactly.
Very cool.
Exactly.
I guess so. How do you how do you define the duration or the easing? Like, what's the interface look like for this?
Yep. So we're still talking about the static version. You just give it some
Right.
text, and let me talk about how I built it. But the duration is just hard coded right now. So it takes you can do 1 second, you can do 10 seconds, basically whatever you want. But you can pass it in, or it's just hard coded. I was thinking you can also make it adaptive so that the rate of reveal is the same. So if you wanted it to be the same speed of animating revealed words, regardless if you pass it a paragraph or a chapter, then you would take your rate per segment and then multiply it by the amount of segments that you wanted. So you could do that as well. But I
So
was building this
longer.
for AI, so I wanted it to be a constant time. But yes, you could make it
Yeah.
so that longer text that you pass in leads to a longer overall duration, so that the duration per segment is the same.
Right. You either fix reveal time or reveal time based off how much you're passing.
Exactly.
Very cool.
And that would be like the teleprompter case. You could have like a
Right.
foot pedal that like pauses and starts and stops. Every time you start, it's going to be moving at the same rate.
Right. Yeah, it is kind of interesting, like how, like you chose to do constant overall time for this,
Right.
and that does feel right for if your goal is to have something that works with AI, because you can do cool animations, but at the end of the day, the user asking the AI a question wants the answer as quickly as possible.
Exactly.
So
That's
if
why.
if they get a really long answer, they don't want a really long animation.
Exactly.
Teleprompter is a complete opposite. They want a consistent rate because if they're speaking a lot, they don't want to have all that text dumped on them in 10 seconds. So
Right.
it is
Right.
interesting how the use case defines like how you think about the duration.
Yep. Absolutely. So it works by itself, and let's talk about the code really quick. So you pass in the text, you pass in how you want to split it, um, character, word, or line. And I want to call out here. There's a cool thing that was it Paco who called out on my tweet. I think it was Paco. International segment. What is it called? Segment. There's an international dot segmenter API that was added to the browser, which is pretty cool. So normally, if you wanted to split a text, let's say like the first three paragraphs of Great Gatsby by word, well, in English, space is separated word. So I just do like the string dot split and then pass in like quote space quote. So you're splitting this into an array of segments based on this delimiter. But in other languages, sometimes you have like Chinese characters all without that are not space delimited words. Words in other languages aren't always space delimited. So how would you solve this? Well, there's a browser API. You create a new international segmenter. You pass in like the language code, and then it has an option called granularity, and granularity can be word or sentence, or grapheme, which is split the inputs into segments at grapheme cluster, user perceived character boundaries as determined by the locale. So it's basically the same three things: character, word, and sentence.
Yeah. This reminds me very much of like the date formatting and the money
Yes.
formatting that
Yes.
browsers can do, where you give it a
Yep.
locale and it takes care of all the stuff you don't want to have to think about.
Truly. You can do this with numbers too. Like there's a currency one, but yes, if you have a number, I just used this the other day, two locale format, and it adds like a comma in America to the thousands place. It adds like a period if you're in England or whatever.
Nice.
Pretty
Very
awesome.
nice.
So, anyways, that's a cool little one. I'll put a link in that to the show notes too. But basically, you get the text, you split it by the delimiter, and I have a buffered index that I start at 0, and then I kick off a use effect. So, for those of you who've used Framer Motion, a lot of the times you're using its kind of declarative APIs. That's a lot of what we teach too when we talk about it, because that's mostly how most often you use Framer Motion. But anything like a motion div that has like, animate, rotate 360, and then transition, repeat infinity. So you just have something spinning. All of that is just sugar on top of motion values, which are objects that you can create on your own. And then you can call animate on them when things change. Framer Motion's taking care of like calling start and stop with those if your React component re-renders with new state. But that's under the hood what's happening. It's something we talk about in our course because it's good to know that under the hood, because a lot of times you hit the limits of these declarative APIs and you just want to, create motion values and then call animate on them. So that's what I'm doing here. And the cool thing about animate and motion values is it doesn't even have to be tied to anything. You can literally just call animate 0 to 1 and then use like an easing curve, give it a duration, repeat, or whatever, and then you just kick off an animated motion value. And now you can like transform it into other things, or you can listen for changes to it. So pretty awesome.
Question: when you say it doesn't need to be tied to anything, so you're saying you create you create a motion value from 0 to 1, and then you animate it, and that's like just going to progressively. It's going to go from like 0 to 0.1 to 0.2 all the way up to 1.
Exactly. So you create a motion value and you have a single state. It's like 0. So it's just at 0. And then you can call animate on it, and you can pass animate a motion value. The way you get a motion value is use motion value. So it's a hook. But if you call animate and then you pass in progress, which is at 0, it's a motion value at 0. And then for the next argument, you pass in 1, it's going to use default transition options, and it's going to kick off an animation for that number. Now, the cool thing about this is if you did this with React State, your React component would re-render as often as that state is changing. But because you want animations to run at 60 frames a second, and that's not appropriate that's not appropriate to use for re-rendering React components, this happens outside of the React rendering cycle. So use motion value is part of render, but once you get it, it's kind of like you're getting a ref. It's kind of like you're getting a ref that points to this motion value that has a current value. It also has memory about um, if it's animating, if it's being animated, or what its current velocity is. So it's kind of like a ref. And when you call animate, framer motion is going to start changing it. So you kind of like leave React, you do your GPU intensive stuff, and then at some point you need to come back to React, right? At some point you need to come back either to the DOM to make changes, or you kind of subscribe to updates to this thing, or you transform it into something else, and then at some point you kind of come back into React.
I like to think of it as like I think of it as like a box. So
Yes.
you get a box, your React component gets this box, and you can peek inside of it and you can see all these
Yes.
gears inside of it moving. But React just sees a box.
Yes. It's
React
like a
doesn't see.
ref.
Yeah, exactly. Ref
Yeah.
is great. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are ways you can like hook into the box,
Yes.
see when values change, and then tell React to re-render by doing something like setting some state with like the next revealed word or something like that.
Exactly. Exactly. So that's exactly how to think about this. You have this thing that's updating smoothly every request animation frame, but we only care about re-rendering our React app when we have a new word, when we've hit a new threshold that shows a new word. Because now we need to update the state of the buffered text, like the buffered text changes, and that's when our parent component needs to know that so that it gets the value from the hook and it behaves just like text, and now it updates it again.
Very cool. Very, very cool.
Yeah. So that's how it works. So you get the motion value, and then I use an effect, right? And uh, when you first render, you kick off the animation inside of use effect. So you call animate progress to 1. And then there's this hook which people who have used firmware motion probably are familiar with. It's called use motion value event. And you can pass that. You can call that as well. Give it a motion value like progress. And here's you can do your logic. But there's also an on update option to the animate function. So you can just in a single effect, it's like this hook is 47 lines of code completely. And it's interruptible, which we'll get to in a second. In the effect, you call animate progress to 1, and then you pass in your duration and ease if you want, and then you have an on update, which yields back the latest value as this thing is animating. And that's where you calculate, okay, we're at 0.2, so we're 20% of the way through. This thing should be 20% revealed. I'm going to multiply 20% times the amount of segments I have, and then I'm going to return the buffered text based on that new index.
Is that where you call something like set state in there?
Yes, I call set buffered index on the update. So that's cool because it's all tidy right here. We're going outside of React, kicking off an animation, and then saying if math.floor of latest times segment length, I'm just going to call set on that. And only when it changes, React, you can call set state on the same thing. But if it changes, it's going to cause a re-render. So if you put a log in on update and you put a log in render, and I kick this off, I'm going to see update, 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 render, update, 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 render. So pretty neat little visualization of like leaving and coming back into React. So that all works fantastic with just text. Now you add streaming because the whole point of this thing was to account for the prop, the text prop changing, and you regardless of how much it changes, you keep the steady output, a smooth output. So what happens if you re-render? So now let's go back to the page. You get a chunk from your stream, and you had the first paragraph of Great Gatsby. Now you get a stream, a new chunk from the back end. That's the second paragraph. So you call in your page set text function, arrow function, previous text equals previous text, and then return previous text plus the new text. So now text is different. And so the unbuffered version would just show the first paragraph, and then it would just show the second paragraph all at once. So how do we animate it? Well, you put the first paragraph in, the buffered paragraph starts animating, and you get like 10% through. Now you call set text again with the second paragraph. So now your hook re-renders. You've revealed 10% of the first paragraph, but now you have a second paragraph. So
You've
what do you?
doubled the amount. So does that mean that all of a sudden you have to like reveal the next 10% to to keep it at quote like 10%.
But you don't want to do that because if you get a bunch of
No, it would
chunks,
be
you don't
awful.
want.
It would be
Yes,
awful.
exactly.
It'd be all janky and text flashing on the screen.
Exactly. So how would you talk out how you would solve this if you were just writing it out?
Well, I think where my mind goes is I just got new text, and so I need to go faster. If I'm gonna display all this text in a second, and I started with a like 100 words, and then you're telling me like 10% of the way through you added in 100 more words, so I have 200 words now. I feel like if I'm gonna hit displaying all the text by the end of some duration, let's say a second, I
Hmm.
would need to speed up.
Right.
So I
Let's
think
set
I
aside the duration and say that
okay.
every time you get a new text, you just restart and it's going to take a second from the last stream to get to the end. Let's think about the cursor position. So let's say you have 100 segments in the first paragraph
Oh,
and you
okay.
got 10% of the way through. Now you throw a second paragraph at it, so your hook's going to re-render.
I would treat like my new 0 at 10% and my new 1 at 100%, the end of the second paragraph. And then,
Exactly.
okay, cool.
So where would you and how would you do that in the code?
Ask that a different way. How would I do that
So
in a
you
code?
need the 10% is the new zero. Basically, you need to remember that 10% somehow.
Yep. Oh, I would think in the effect there'd be some like text changed, and I always get if ever I say in an effect I'm gonna do something changed between X and Y. I usually know I'm in for like a lot of pain, like not pain because it's hard, but pain because I'm doing something wrong. You know what I mean? So like that's usually like a so there I would
I hear what you're saying, but I think this is kind of what I wanted to talk about this because
mhm.
you're exactly right. Basically, you're 10% through the first paragraph and you're on your merry way animating. You've got the 90% rest, but then all of a sudden, React hits you with a re-render. So
Yep.
you're like, what now? First of all, you return a cleanup from the effect that stops the current animation,
Cool.
and you need to stash where you're at because you're 10% of the way through. But 10% of the first render meant to show like 10 segments.
Yeah, how many
But now you
characters or where
have
your cursor
200
is.
segments. Now you have exactly where your cursor is. Now you have 200 segments. And so if I'm only 10 segments through of 200, then I'm really only at 5%, right? Because my text is twice as long. So
Mhm.
basically, what you do is you stash like the previous length. You could stash the previous length. You basically need to know how much we had before. And exactly like you said, you could put it in a ref in the effect. In the effect, you could basically store it, right? You could stash it in something. Um, you could also do this thing where you put it in state, which there's a great documentation page on the React docs, which is how do you store information from previous renders. And usually in React, we don't want to think about it like this. That's usually an indication that there's probably a better way to do it because you want to think of like all the state you need to be declared somewhere and you want to be able to re-render things um, just from top down. And it's like just like your reducer functions should be like pure. It's kind of like that idea of like usually you don't need memory to render the current state of the app, but sometimes you do. Um, if we're scrolling a document and we know the scroll position, I don't know if I actually just got to scroll top of 100 pixels because I was scrolling down or scrolling up. That's an example of information from the previous render. And
Mhm.
here, if I re-render my useBufferedText hook and it has two paragraphs now, in order for me to know where to start, that the progress should actually be at 5%, I need to know that previously it was at 10% of, 100 segments. Or you could just think of like the previous segment location, like
Yeah,
how
yeah, yeah,
many,
yeah.
the index, the previous index, like the buffered index. So that's exactly what I do. And then to your, it's kind of following up here, you can store it in state like in the React docs, or you can put it on a ref in the effect as long as that ref is only ever read from or written to in another effect. And so I've started doing this more, and we're not even gonna get into my scroller thing because that's the part of this that makes it all come together pretty neat. But this hook is neat on its own. The um the scroller also does things like looks at the scroll position, looks at use a resize observer, all this information you need to code the behavior of the component. Um, you basically have this choice when you need to know kind of how things have changed. Do I save the change in an effect in a ref, or do I like set it in state and cause a re-render? And basically, like the more I've done these kind of like scroll based animated things that kind of feel like they need to go outside of render for a bit, right? Like your React component doesn't know like the scroll position or the cursor position, the select position. So you're kind of in effect land whenever you're interacting with these things. The more I've done things where I don't need to re-render and I can just do it in a ref and check the logic in my effect, the easier it's gotten for me. So all that to say, as soon as you return the effect, you stop the animation. You've stashed the previous, either the length of the segments that you used to have or the index that you used to have. Now you get a re-render, and now you have two paragraphs coming in text, and now you're going to run your effect again. And the effect, instead of animating progress from 0 to 1, it animates it from the previous. It jumps it to the previous value, which we now know
Mm-hmm.
is 0.05, right? Because 10% of one paragraph is 5% of two paragraphs, and you can use all that to calculate it. So you call progress motion value dot jump to that, and then you kick off the animation again to 1. And so now it's fully interruptible. So now if you start throwing stream chunks at it, every time you get a chunk, it cancels the previous animation and jumps it to the current state, which the new calculated position, and then it returns like the buffered text, which is going to be equivalent to what it was before, except now you have a lot more, and then it keeps going. And it's cool because you can throw chunks at it, and the thing just keeps going, and it's always going to finish 1 second after kind of the last update that you got. So the unbuffered version is just like throwing, it's like eating text on the screen. The buffered version is like maybe it starts out slow and then it starts going faster so that you always kind of just like you would expect from like a chat GPT, kind of like you said, you have a UI where you want to see the answer as fast as possible. It gets you there regardless, and it looks really smooth. So it was a really fun little project.
So basically, like from when I receive the last chunk, I'm always a second away from getting my
Exactly.
full answer. Very cool. Very, very
Exactly.
cool.
But if you've had 10 chunks within the last second, you're still going to see all the text reveal. It's just going to and it's going to be smooth. It's just going to be fast. So it's kind of like you can catch up. Uh,
Yeah.
you can catch up. You basically always catch up. But you always get to see every segment revealed, regardless of if you were already animating something or you had like three chunks come in within a second.
Nice. Must be nice to write that when you go from, okay, I have one static paragraph, and then I go from 1 to 2, and that's all the logic you just explained. And then like all of a sudden you throw like 15 paragraphs at it and it
Exactly.
just works. Like that must be
Exactly.
such a good feeling, you
It
know?
was incredibly satisfying. And then when you combine it with the scrolling thing, it's cool because if you scroll based on the size of the content, now you can scroll whether you use the text or the buffered text. And so you can wrap your normal text coming from an LLM into an auto scroller, and every chunk it just scrolls smoothly. And I'm doing that with Framer Motion as well because there's no cross browser API for like smoothly scrolling to a position that behaves the same in all browsers. And now you have a scrolling response from an LLM that it keeps up with it, but if you get like 3 or 4 or 5 chunks, it's gonna go to the bottom, and it looks choppy. It looks really choppy because you
Yep.
could just be getting like 3 or 4 tokens at a time or something like that. Now all you do is you just pass text in to use buffered text and replace the text with buffered text response value. Um, and now it both smoothly does it and it scrolls, but the scrolling is controlled by the size of the window. So because the buffered text is held back in a buffer, it doesn't like jump ahead. It just operates on the size that's actually been animated by buffered text.
Very cool. Very cool. I have some.
It's one of those projects where you're just at night and you're React is the freaking coolest thing ever. Like all this stuff comes together. It's so much fun.
Love to hear it. Love to see it. Um, I have some questions about like how to think about this. If specifically if you're working with like responses from LLMs. Um, so I guess one is like when you generate code from an LLM, you will sometimes get a React component where each line is just like a couple characters, like a line that says set state to a Boolean. That's not that line length is very short.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but when you're in like JSX land, especially like we work with Tailwind, if you
Mm-hmm.
have Tailwind classes, your line length gets really long,
Mm-hmm.
like really long.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you like? How would you think about like doing a scrolling for like scrolling and revealing that everything you just talked about for something that has like a React component that has some really short lines and then some really long lines?
It's a good question. Um, so the way, and we'll have to talk about this one in detail next time. And I want to share it so people can pick at it and share what they've done because I had some folks who work on like um, the new Stack Blitz.new thing does a lot of scrolling, and I had some folks who work on different things comment, reply and say that how am I doing it, what the stuff that they ran into, because it gets really tricky. But the simple version of it is my scroller has a resize observer on the scrollable area. So it knows, it doesn't care whether you have, a single variable declaration or like a Tailwind div with like, 20 Tailwind classes because it's not going to fire its callback until the resize observer fires. Um, is that what you're asking? So the way I do it is I look at the resize observer, and then when it resizes, I add like a buffered white space to the bottom that shrinks as it resizes, and then once it runs out of space, it just does it again and scrolls to the bottom, and that's how it like keeps up with the bottom of the scrollable content.
Cool, cool. Yeah, more like just
Or is it like a question about UI, like
yeah,
just like
it's more about
like
UI,
okay,
like
yeah,
because like you
yeah,
said with the teleprompter example, that's a very
yeah,
different use case, and you want to
it
think of the
is.
timing
Yep,
differently. And with the AI stuff, it's yeah, it's
yeah,
like different. And this is
yes,
also like UIs that didn't exist
yeah,
2 years ago, and so
right.
I think it's I always like
Yep.
hearing your thoughts on just like how you think about this and how you
Yep, yep. No,
reveal
that's a great
content.
question. I think you have to start with the goal. I think the way you summarized it in the beginning was really nice, where I'm getting an answer and I want to get to the bottom as fast as possible. Um, that's a good use case for a constant time from last chunk. And if I'm giving you something where I want to read it as it's coming out and I don't want to be overwhelmed, it's really like a progress indicator. You can think of like of all this stuff as like a progress indicator, but it makes a difference because it just feels a lot nicer than just the chunking, the automatic chunking, especially that comes from some models that are smaller and open source and all over the place. Um, it's distracting for a lot of reasons. One example is if you're passing code to a syntax highlighter and you give it half a line and
Mm.
that breaks the syntax highlighting. So maybe you want to buffer by like line by new line, right? And the buffered text thing can do that. Um, so uh, back to your question, I think the idea in this hook supports all kind of modes. You have like an indeterminate thing where you don't know when the next chunk is coming, and you just want to reveal things just to show that there's progress happening, and you don't want to just like yeet the blocks on to the page because it just is like doesn't look pretty. There's another version that kind of to what your last point was is you could have new lines coming in almost not splitting by new line, but let's say you're rendering the Great Gatsby into a paragraph container. Well, you can actually get reflows because a token comes through that's half a word and you even use buffered text and get it, but then the next chunk contains the rest of the word and now it wraps.
Yeah, you don't know if the word is the or there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So it's almost like
Exactly.
you can't. You have to get split by space or whatever the
You
fancy term
couldn't you
for
can't the delimiter. You can't do that
the.
though because if you're wrapping text, the you don't know until you render it how many lines it should be. So I've thought about this. In this
Yeah.
case, where you
Okay.
had text that wraps by the browser, the layout algorithm, then you would need to basically go a few lines ahead and have like my little buffer thing kind of cover it and like reveal it with a gradient or something like that. So you could do that. And I had like a little demo of doing that too, which looked pretty neat. I think like Claude does some sort of fading reveal thing.
How distracting is that if you're doing something like text or code and there's layout shift? Is that something in your mind where it's like I don't like that we're going down a bad path if we're getting layout
I
shift?
I, I think this I one of the reasons I wanted to make this was because I thought about it and I thought it would be nice to come up with a solution that composes in React that works with all these different apps we've been working on. And so to me, it is a clear improvement over the default, especially when you have a drop down and you don't know what model you're going to be using and they all respond at different rates and everything. So that's kind of the goal with this hook. If you really wanted to make sure that there's no layout shift, you would need to do some ahead of time rendering. Either you don't reveal until you've hit the next line with like a gradient or something, um, or just something that's like basically you have something that covers up the last line and it's nudged up by like the current line height so you know it can cover
Yeah.
the last line of text, and that way if you ever get to that point the resizer takes care of scrolling to the bottom and you'll never see layout shift on the last line. It'll still occur because you don't know until you get it. There's no way to avoid that
It's
happening.
but you're saying because it's behind that hidden gradient
Right,
last line. Yeah,
exactly.
cool.
Last two lines I guess you would need.
Yeah.
You need the last line to know what the second to last line looks like. Sounds like a recursive problem. But yeah, so that's how I think about that. But there's a lot. I want to put this out there because I want people to play with it, and I think it'd be fun. There's so many like little playgrounds you could do with this, where you have kind of what you said, which is like, um, how would you get a constant speed animation, where it's revealing the buffer at the same rate. So if you wanted it to be a little bit slower, so you could kind of read along. I was like tweaking with it, and I put it up to like 10 seconds, and I had my back end like stream out a big chunk of Great Gatsby, and I could like read as the words came out. And I was like, this is actually a pretty awesome way to read the book, and it like
Oh.
auto scrolls. I was like, I could just sit back here and like drink a scotch and smoke a cigar and read Great Gatsby without like touching a book or like my cursor. I was like, this is actually pretty neat. And I've seen apps like this before that like show you the word in the middle of the screen and it
Yeah, yeah,
changes or
yeah,
it
yeah.
auto scrolls. I think it's a pretty, there's like a lot of cool use cases for this.
Yeah, I also love that how you immediately went to if you didn't have to scroll, you would grab a scotch and a cigar. I
Yeah,
just love that. That's
exactly.
what you
Two
would do with your
hands,
free hands.
boom.
Yeah.
They would just like, they would just appear there, you know, like LLM. I want to read my book and then just, so you could do that. The thing that is cool about this resetting. Also, I wanted to point this out from a code perspective. When I first wrote it, I had an effect that kicked off the animation and cleaned it up, and then I had use motion value event as a second hook, and I responded to it and I calculated the new buffered index and I set it. And when I've done this in the past, when you split logic, especially for animations, imperative animations across different effects, which this basically is because use motion value event is implemented with use effect, it's hard to know like the order of things that happen. And also, um, I like had to put something in state to share it between the effects. Maybe maybe I just had to put it into a ref because I if you didn't need it outside of that, you wouldn't. Anyways, I love that I found this on update callback because I have a single effect and it makes everything easier to reason about. And this was even more true with my auto scroller. So my auto scroller started out with this is a big takeaway from this, and then we can wrap up. My auto scroller, you think about what an auto scroller needs to do. And maybe if I'm scrolled to the bottom, I want it to auto scroll. But if I start scrolling up, I don't want it to automatically scroll. right? Because, just like in ChatGPT, you can scroll up and read it. It's still generating, but like you now are the source of truth
You're
for
like
the scroll
detached.
bar. Yes, you're detached. So how would you do this? Well, if you Google this, you might get like a use scroll position hook, and it returns the state of the scroll position. And so now you have the scroll position. Maybe you have like a use size hook that you pass to the ref of the container. And if they're the same, you write an effect that checks like the state of the scroll position and the size of the box. And in the effect, if they're the same, then you know you're scrolled to the bottom and you should auto scroll if it changes. These hooks, like use scroll position and use measure, are returning state, use mouse position, right? All these things that set up event handlers and set state so you get a re-render. But just like my buffered text example, which needed to do some logic when the animation changed and the animation was outside of React, the auto scroller needs to do the same thing. The scroll position is outside of React. The size of the get bounding client rect and how the resize observer fires is outside of React. My code got so much cleaner when I went from use scroll position that returns React state and do logic on that state to use on scroll, which takes a callback and lets me do whatever I want inside of this tidy effect. And eventually I'm going to be setting state, but I'm not trying to use scroll position and use bounds and then do my state. I'm doing everything in use on scroll and use on resize with refs. And it's very clear when I exit this gnarly land that I'm in of imperative code and go back to setting a declarative property that my React app needs, like is auto scrolling or not. So I can show like a little arrow with a button. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Also, too, that my takeaway from listening to that was that you care mainly about the events that are happening. And when you use something
Exactly.
like use scroll position, you are now using a state update to try to approximate an event that happened. But really,
Exactly.
all you want is that an event happened.
100%. And I've seen this been going around Twitter as well. People are talking about doing things that set state and then use operating on that state in another effect. You're kind of like, based on this conversation, I kind of like this new mental model. If you're going out of React to read from the browser, just to
And then
write
go
to
back into
React, so
React.
and go to React just so you can go back into an effect and go out of React again, you're better off not using React as like the transport mechanism for that data. You just want to stay in event land. I think there's a lot of libraries in React where they do things like use window size, use bounds, use scroll position, use mouse position. And those are great if that is your exit point, but usually you want to use mouse position so that you know if you're close to an element so that you can do something else. So that you know if you're hovered or pressed, not because you actually care
Yeah.
about every mouse position in React state.
A
So
good a good test for this is that if you use something like use mouse position and you find yourself rendering those X and the Y values, like you're actually just updating pixels on the screen,
right,
displaying them.
exactly.
It's pretty good to use a hook like
Yeah,
that.
it's
But
appropriate. Yeah.
yeah, but I guess if you're using those to just feed into an effect, to your point,
Exactly. Exactly. If
you
you're
just
just
want it.
looking at those inside of an effect to do some other logic that eventually causes pixels on the screen to render, then you should have never set that state to begin with.
So what is the answer there? The answer there is like in the mouse position, getting close to something, you would write like a use close to hook that takes a ref and it
Or even a
fires
use on mouse move hook.
use a,
And it
okay.
takes in either body or div, and then it gives you a callback with the latest X and Y. And so that you're staying in event land. You could throw that on a ref if you needed it in some other event.
And
It's
this
so
is
much
why,
easier.
and this is why you liked the on update from Framer Motion, because
Exactly.
let you do all this.
Exactly. Exactly. I feel like it was a really big like moment for me where I've written so many little things like this, but this was like even just talking about it in this podcast, I really like this mental model of don't come back to React until you need pixels on the screen. If you're writing something like Figma and you want to show the coordinates, yeah, you need the pixels.
Yeah.
If you need to scroll something, you almost never need to know the scroll height. The reason you're reading the scroll height from a scroll event in some scrollable container is because you need to know whether to auto scroll or not, for example. So that is when you need to either, and maybe even then you don't need to go back into React, because if you need to auto scroll, well, guess what? That's just another browser interaction. That's not an imperative call to a browser API. But maybe if you scroll up, like in ChatGPT, pixels are going to change because you want to show a little indicator that you can click to resume auto scrolling, right? Or like in Slack when it says jump to latest once you start scrolling up, that's pixels
Yep.
on the screen. So even though you need the scroll event to know whether or not to show that, you don't need every scroll event. All you need to know is, have I scrolled up X pixels from the bottom? Now I'm going to flip this state. I'm going back into React. It makes your effects like so much tidier. Like it's crazy. And I feel like I could open a React app that has a bunch of effects, and a lot of them are probably going to be using state to communicate with logic that other effects need to operate on.
There's I think an awesome conference talk or YouTube video here would be like the like therapeutic refactoring, where
Yes.
we find an example. Probably we can open any one
Yes.
of our apps where
Yes, exactly.
we're using state as that transport layer, and
Yes,
then we refactor it, and you end up with something like a use on scroll or
exactly.
use mouse move or whatever we want to call it.
Yep. Also, I really love here. I've lamented often that we don't have things like use width, use measure, use scroll height, use mouse position inside of React. Like, I just want like an use interval. I want like there to be one way to do this. I don't want to have to write these again. But the reality is today, with especially with like ChatGPT, you can get these pretty quick. And there are subtle differences that you want here. And so it's kind of nice, actually, that these aren't. Anyways, a lot of these are standard issue. A lot of them come, there's like a UI.dev hooks library. And a lot of times we tell people just pull one from those, right? But there's kind of a point here, which is like, you don't actually want to go for maximum composition here. You might think, if I want to make
Yeah.
a scrollable container and I scroll up and I want to show something, I need to know when the content resizes, and I need to know when I scroll my scrollable container. React's composition story is amazing. I can grab use scroll position and use element size hooks, and they don't know anything about the app or the feature I'm building, but I can drop them in. Now I can read the size and the scroll, and I can do an event. I can do my own effect that operates on those, and it flips some state. And yes, it's true you can do that, but it's harder and it's more confusing, because if you start bringing in all these super low level hooks and you have all this state that's updating, and now you need to think about what happens every time it renders, and it's going to kick off this. It's way simpler to just think about the problem in terms of the events that you care about. I want to scroll. Let's just have a use on scroll callback function. That's a hook. That's still going to take care of setting up and tearing down the observers or the
Mm-hmm.
events for me, which is awesome. But it's just way easier than trying to be like maximally composable here. And maybe that's not even a fair way to characterize it. Maybe it's just that you're using
No,
the wrong hook because you don't care about the state. You just care about the callback. You want to run some logic when the event happens.
right. And the composable, these can still be composable. The composable
Yes.
story would be, how do you do a composable thing that can take use on scroll and use on window change
Right.
or use
Right.
on size change? But
Right.
I think your deep point here is
Yeah.
like, don't go back to state and then right back
Right.
out again. And
Right.
yeah,
Right.
that
Yep.
is
It's
that's
a,
really
it's a, it's
powerful.
it's a powerful one. And if it's the event that you need, then use the event until you have another thing here, right? Until it's like, you know, the event is clicking a link. So you might say, oh, well, Sam told me to do it in the event on click. Let's do that. But really now I can click back and forward, and really it's derived from the state of the URL. So in that case, you want to go to the state first because the state has multiple ways of changing. But here, for stuff like this, for stuff like animations, any imperative code you're writing, David K. Piano had a tweet about this recently, and like Ricky was talking about this. Oh, this was an interesting one. Let me pull this one up because Ricky responded. David Korshid said, React tip, avoid using use effect to handle events when you can handle them directly when the event happens. And he has like the no, which is when messages change, do something on submit, set messages. Confusing. Or on submit, set messages and do something, right? So this is the do something part. This is like on scroll, do something. On resize, do something. Um, and it's much, much clearer. And someone said, well, what about visiting a page, like rendering and firing off an analytics service message. So when you render, isn't that like we need to log this page view so that goes in an effect? Like there's no event, there's no like on view on a
I mean,
div.
my initial reaction is like render is the event.
Render is the event. Ricky said this example. So this is what David said. David said for use query, it makes sense because the event is this component was displayed. So put it in effect and do it. Ricky said this example should really be an intersection observer. Usually the event you want is that it was viewed by the user. And I was like, oh man, pretty good,
Because
right?
yeah, because you could render a bunch of components and then but they're outside the scroll area.
Exactly.
So I think my knee jerk reaction to that was like, well, what if it's like data fetching? I want to fetch the data, but this is you shouldn't fetch data in render. This is
Exactly.
we're not going to go down that road. But
That's exactly right. Yeah,
yeah.
that's what David said. Usually, should data fetching should happen sooner, but that's the dev's responsibility.
Yes.
But
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
yep.
Well, that's great. That seriously, what it's not what is the event because we can always say that rendering is an event and we have to get rid of it. So what is a browser event? What is
Right. The browser event. What is
and
the
the
event that the user did?
the user did and the intersection of wow, that is
Isn't that
nice.
awesome?
Yeah, that is nice.
Pretty cool, right? So, anyways, I think I think React made state so easy, and we all think about declarative state and re-renders happening for us, and that's been taken care of for years. And now people are doing more complicated things with animations and scrolls and event-based things. I found myself doing more animations, doing more things that require imperative calls to be thinking and identifying the event as making all of it much, much easier. So, yeah, that's why I wanted to talk about that. Cool. We'll have to talk more about the scrollable implementation next week because it's got some cool stuff.
Yeah.
But I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Before we go, let's
Yep.
mention we are working on a course. We are coming up on some free time that we are actually going to use to wrap it up, and we're hoping, about a month from now for it to be ready. So the course is called Advanced React Component Patterns. You can check it out. I'll put a link in the show notes as well. But yeah, just wanted to mention that we are excited for that when we have a bunch of demos spec'd out for that. And yeah, excited to have some time coming up here to work on it and get this thing out before the end of November for sure. So
Yeah.
you have anything you want to say about it?
And what's the website? Where do they go to sign up for updates?
Well, I'll put it in the show notes. It's
Okay.
go to buildui.com and there's a courses link at the top, and we'll actually add a link to it there. But you can check the show notes as well for a link to that. So I think that's it for this one. I guess we'll see you next week. Thanks for listening, and hit us up on Twitter, Frontend First FM. You can watch us on YouTube and Spotify as well. But that's it for now. So thanks for listening. See you next week.
Cool. See ya.
Bye.